All right, welcome to today's Explainer. Today we are unpacking this truly fascinating case study in human behavior. We're going to look at how one incredibly simple, completely unadvertised daily action managed to fundamentally transform the entire social fabric of a neighborhood. It is such a brilliant look at how communities are actually built, and it really highlights the quiet but absolutely undeniable power of just showing up consistently. So, let's dive right into it. Okay, so I want you to picture this scene. Every single morning, long before the city is even awake, this old baker named Thomas would step out of his shop and he'd place one fresh, brown paper-wrapped loaf of bread right on a wooden bench outside his tiny bakery. He never sold this loaf, he literally never advertised it, he never even stuck around to ask who took it, and for years, absolutely nobody in the neighborhood had any idea what was really going on with this bread. So naturally, you gotta wonder, why? Why on earth is Thomas leaving a perfectly good loaf of bread outside every single morning? It became this massive central mystery that just hung around for years. I mean, his shop wasn't big, we're talking maybe 6 tables inside, but that irresistible, amazing smell of fresh baking bread traveled halfway down the street. Yet that one specific loaf, never on the bakery shelves, never got a price tag, it just sat out there on the bench until, poof, it vanished. And it actually wasn't until one absolutely freezing winter morning that the real secret behind what he was doing was finally revealed to everybody. Now, to really wrap our heads around the why, we have to talk about the number 48. Because that is exactly how many years Thomas spent baking in that one specific neighborhood. He had been baking there since he was a teenager. By the time he was 70 years old, he knew this community so incredibly well that he knew exactly how much flour the neighborhood was going to need every single morning. He was just deeply, fundamentally woven into the fabric of this place. But how did this whole mysterious bench tradition actually get started? Well, the whole tradition of the bench actually started with just a single loaf. One morning, Thomas looked out and noticed this elderly man sitting on the wooden bench outside the bakery, and the guy just looked completely exhausted. So Thomas didn't overthink it. He simply walked inside, grabbed a fresh loaf of bread, came back out, and placed it right beside the man. When the guy looked up, totally surprised, and asked, "How much?" Thomas just smiled and said nothing. The man hesitated for a second, but then quietly took the bread. The next morning, that man wasn't there, but Thomas decided to put another loaf out anyway, and then another. What started as just a tiny, spontaneous micro-habit officially became a daily tradition. And this brilliantly illustrates the underlying psychology of what was actually happening here. On one hand, you have traditional charity, right? Which, let's be honest, often involves having to prove you need help, explaining all your problems to a stranger, and sometimes feeling a real sense of shame. But on the other hand, we have Thomas's model, which is all about dignity. Thomas had one incredibly strict rule for his bench: never ask who needs it. Actually, when his assistant Mia asked him what would happen if someone took the bread who didn't really need it, Thomas just replied, then perhaps they needed kindness. He wasn't just handing out free calories, he was giving people their dignity back. Nobody had to ask for help, they could just take the loaf in secret and walk away. Over the years, this totally hands-off setup led to a steady stream of what we can basically call invisible customers. And the demographic reach here was incredibly diverse. You'd have a tired construction worker grabbing some morning carbs, an unemployed father, a stressed-out student, an elderly woman. Some days, nobody took the bread at all, and Thomas would just bring it back inside at closing time without a single complaint. When Mia asked if he ever got curious about who these people actually were, he admitted he did, sure, but he pointed out a core philosophy of his. Knowing someone's name just isn't a prerequisite for showing them kindness. But, as we know, every system gets tested eventually, right? And the ultimate test for this daily tradition rolled into town in the form of a massive, brutal winter storm. It hit the city so hard that roads were basically impassable, and almost all the shops just threw in the towel and closed their doors. Thomas actually almost decided to close his tiny bakery too. But instead, he looked out at that empty bench before sunrise, and despite the blinding snow and the fact that the streets were like a ghost town, he didn't just place one loaf outside, he placed one, and then another, and then another. His assistant Mia was staring at him in absolute disbelief. She was probably wondering if he had completely lost his mind, right? She told him, flat out, that absolutely nobody would be crazy enough to come outside in that kind of weather. But Thomas's response was just 2 simple words: someone might. I just want to pause here for a second, because that right there, that is the absolute core of his incredible faith in his community. And you know what? He was absolutely right. Someone did. A young mother trudged through the freezing snow, took a single loaf, looked back at the bakery where Thomas gave her a little wave, smiled, and then disappeared right back into the storm.
The very next morning, Thomas went outside and found a folded piece of paper tucked right beneath the bench. It was an anonymous note, and it read, "You probably don't know me, but your bread helped my family survive a difficult winter. I couldn't afford to ask anyone for help. Your loaf allowed me to feed my children without feeling ashamed. I hope one day I can do for someone else what you did for me." Thomas read that note twice, and then he quietly tucked it away into his old recipe book. Guys, that is the true, raw psychological impact of dignity in action.
And this is exactly where one man's quiet micro-habit exploded into a full-blown, community-wide phenomenon. A few months later, Mia noticed something totally unexpected happening outside. The bench was beginning to overflow, but not with bread. Neighbors were starting to leave items of their own. Suddenly there's a bag of oranges out there, a box of cereal, a warm blanket, even a pair of children's shoes. Someone actually left a handwritten message that essentially became the brand new rule of the bench. Take what you need, leave what you can.
Let's just think about the timeline of how this escalated, because it's pretty wild. On day one, it's literally just a single loaf of bread handed to an exhausted guy. Fast forward to that bitter winter storm, and the psychological impact really takes root with that mother's note about feeding your kids without the burden of shame. And finally, years later, the whole thing completely evolves into this incredible community bench. Think about this. No official organization created this. There was no advertising budget, no marketing campaign, just one small, unadvertised act of providing dignity that systematically inspired a completely self-sustaining tradition of neighbors actively helping neighbors. It's just a beautiful ripple effect. Eventually, after 48 years of waking up before dawn and baking, Thomas decided it was finally time to retire. On his very last morning, he baked one final loaf, wrapped it up carefully, placed it on the bench, and just stood there quietly taking it all in. But within minutes, something amazing happened. People started showing up. The construction worker, the student, the elderly woman, the mother from the snowstorm. Dozens of people who had taken the bread over the years all gathered around. When a totally shocked Thomas asked, "You remember me?" one woman smiled and said, "We remember the bread, and we remember how you gave it." They never forgot that he never made them jump through hoops to prove they deserved a little help. Standing there, before this crowd of people whose lives he had so quietly touched over the decades, Thomas delivered one final, profound lesson. He said, "Never make kindness complicated." It is such a brilliant, elegant takeaway. You don't need to be rich to make a real difference in your community. You don't need to launch a massive campaign to change the entire world overnight. Sometimes, literally all you need to do is just notice that someone else is having a hard time and take one tiny step to make their day just a little bit easier. So Thomas's bakery eventually closed its doors for good, but you know what? That wooden bench remained right where it was, and every single morning somebody still placed food on it. Sometimes it was bread, sometimes fruit, sometimes just an encouraging note. Because kindness